When water killed, beer saved London. We see footage of the dirty River Thames in the 1800s. There's a thick layer of smog hanging over the river. People are seen washing clothes in the river or fetching water with buckets. The camera pans up to show a sign that reads, "Beware of the water." It was the 1800s, and the River Thames ran right through the heart of London. It provided drinking water, cleaning water, and apparently plenty of disease. Every year, thousands of Londoners died from cholera and typhoid fever, and it all came from one place, the Thames. But here's the twist. There was a drink that could save you from the water, and it was beer. Not your typical Bud Light or Coors Light either. These were tiny glasses of weak ale, about half the size of a shot glass, containing around 0.2% alcohol. If you can find a beer that weak today, let me know. Today, I am going to tell you the surprising story of how small beers saved London and how brewers became public health heroes before anyone knew what germs were. Let's start with why the Thames was such a mess. Back in the 1800s, London had zero sewage infrastructure. There were no sewer pipes or sewage plants. In fact, there were barely any building codes or regulations whatsoever. Many factories would dump their leftover chemicals into the river. Chemical plants released sulfurous gases that smelled like rotten eggs and stained the river black. Tanneries released lime and tan stuff. People emptied their chamber pots out their window into the street or straight into the river. Houses were built right along the river banks, so you can imagine the kind of stench that filled the air. No wonder the Thames was nicknamed the Great Stink. But the thing was, it wasn't just a horrible nuisance, it was deadly. For example, the river would turn green every summer. That's because of algae that grew on the surface, which happened whenever the water sat too long without moving. That's also when the fish would die, sometimes in such large numbers that the river would turn white with their bodies. All that rotting fish produced hydrogen sulfide gas, which could knock you unconscious if you inhaled enough of it. Let's put it another way. If you saw a green river today, you wouldn't drink the water. Back then, hundreds of Londoners drank water from the Thames every day. That water was full of everything from dead animals to dead people. In fact, 17th century English physician Richard Manningham once wrote, "The Thames is so pure that if any man did drink of it, he would live forever, or till he were drunk." Let's hope he took that metaphorically, and the biggest problem was invisible. The water contained all kinds of bacteria and other microbes that caused diseases. The problem was nobody knew that yet. Doctors believed that diseases came from bad air, or so they thought. So people who lived near the river or drank from it constantly breathed in what they called miasma and became ill. So it seemed like a mystery. How were so many people getting sick? Or if they did know that the river was the culprit, why did they keep drinking it? Well, they really didn't have a choice. See, the water was used not only for drinking, but for cleaning. Washing clothes, brushing teeth, watering crops, pretty much everything. And it was until they could just build new aqueducts to bring in fresh water from somewhere else. Just a few years earlier, London had nearly bankrupted itself trying to bring fresh water into the city from an aqueduct in the neighboring county. Now, even though that plan failed, the Thames still gave them tons of water, so they had to use it. Now, back to our story. In the late 1800s, doctors began to understand that bad air didn't make people sick. Instead, something far tinier did. Today, we know those tiny particles are germs. But back then, they didn't have a microscope to see those germs. And the idea of putting tiny microorganisms under a magnifying glass hadn't even been invented yet. All they knew was that something invisible was causing disease, and they were clueless about what that was. All they knew was that something invisible was making people sick. So they started calling these mysterious particles animalcules, which just means little animals. And they hypothesized that these animalcules bred in foul places like swamps, graveyards, and sewers, which obviously included the Thames. So if you wanted to avoid disease, you should avoid that contaminated air coming off the river, or so they thought. But here's the thing. Most people couldn't afford to move away from the river. So they needed a way to survive in the stinky environment. Enter small beer. As I mentioned, small beer was a type of low-alcohol beer that people were already drinking for various reasons. It was cheap, easy to brew, and went well with food. But it just so happened that small beer saved Londoners without them even realizing it. You see, brewing beer requires boiling water and that process kills off most germs. Then when the beer ferments, carbon dioxide replaces oxygen in the beer, creating an environment where most germs can't survive. Finally, sealing the beer in a container prevents new germs from getting in. Basically, when people were brewing beer, they were unknowingly filtering out the germs that caused disease. And that wasn't even on purpose. Nobody knew anything about germs. No. To be clear, small beer didn't single-handedly eradicate disease in London, but it certainly helped. Scientists think that since the poor drank small beer, while the rich were drinking safer water from wells, small beer may have lowered the death rates of the poor by 20 to 50%. And it's not just historians and scientists who think this. Breweries were some of the first businesses to implement clean water measures in England. Sure, it was mostly to protect their product, but that ended up protecting their customers. Some breweries created their own private water supply in wells to ensure the safety of their ingredients. Others added lime to their water to filter out impurities. Most of them boiled their water, and some even pasteurized their beer, though they didn't know it at the time. And it worked. One study found that employees of breweries were 40% less likely to die of cholera than those who didn't work at breweries. And that was before scientists even knew what caused cholera. Now, you might be thinking that this sounds unbelievable. After all, we're talking about brewers who probably didn't even know what yeast was, inventing processes that we're just now understanding. But it's true. Brewers became public health heroes before we even knew what germs were. They were simply trying to make a good product. But in doing so, they were also saving lives. It took decades for the science to catch up. Even after Londoners switched over to cleaner water in the 1800s, they still drank more beer than water. Dr. John Snow was one of the first men to change that. He was the man who finally mapped cholera in London to the water supply. You see, in 1854, there was a cholera outbreak in London, and many people, including Dr. Snow, suspected the water. At the time, everyone thought cholera spread through the air. But Dr. Snow noticed that people in the neighborhood around this Broad Street pump were getting sick disproportionately. So he drew up a map of the area and marked every single death. Then he noticed that almost every death was near that water pump. He removed the pump's handle, and within weeks, the deaths stopped. Fortunately, Dr. Snow's discovery was ignored for decades, but it paved the way for future discoveries about how water causes disease. And maybe one day we'll discover that those animalcules that Dr. Snow observed were actually yeast. These days, we take clean water for granted. There's a reason why they call it the tap. It's just there. But that wasn't always the case. Over the past 100 years, we've developed water treatment plants. Chlorine, to kill germs, and a whole host of other measures to make sure that the water coming out of your tap doesn't come out looking like this. But that hasn't always been the case. And this story shows that history is hiding in plain sight. Sometimes it's literally in your glass. Okay, class, that's today's lesson over. And you can keep learning history through additional resources. Check the description below for more information.